The Passion according to St. Luke, chapter 23, verses 1 through 49. Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying,
"We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king."
Then Pilate asked him.
"Are you the king of the Jews?"
He answered.
You say so.
Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds,
"I find no basis for an accusation against this man."
but they were insistent and said,
"He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee, where he began, even to this place."
When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this they had been enemies. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them,
"You have brought me this man as one who was perverting the people. And here I have examined him in your presence and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him."
Then they all shouted out together,
"Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us!"
This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting.
"Crucify! Crucify him!"
A third time he said to them,
"Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no grounds for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him."
But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished. As he led them away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned and said,
Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?
2 others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said,
Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing.
And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching, but the leaders scoffed at him, saying, The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying,
"If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself."
There was also an inscription over him, This is the King of the Jews. One of the criminals who was hanged there kept deriding him and saying,
Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us.
But the other rebuked him, saying,
Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong.
Then he said,
Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom.
he replied,
Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise.
It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, while the sun's light failed and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said,
Father, into your hands I commend my spirit.
Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said,
Certainly, this man was innocent.
When all the crowd who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things. Holy wisdom, holy word.
Thanks be to God. We are witnesses today to Jesus' passion, a word that means suffering, but also a word that means love. Powerful love. Life-altering love. Love that gives of itself until the end. We are witnesses. Our worship this morning began with a procession. A bunch of us, children, parents, youth, walked, palms in hand, from our church's Loder Avenue entrance down Main Street and then processed around the church singing Hosanna, loud Hosanna. Jesus rode into Jerusalem roughly 2,000 years ago to the sounds of his followers singing that same Passover psalm, the psalm pilgrims would sing when they went up to the Temple Mount. Hosanna, that word means save us. He rode in as a king, but what a strange king he was. Most kings would ride into a city on a war horse, an animal bred for power and speed, bred for battle. But Jesus, the king, rode in on a donkey, a beast of burden. And we are witnesses. This king came not to rule, but to serve. And the people cheered for him. They too carried palm branches and waved them as they sang. They laid down their cloaks so that the hooves of the animal he rode would not touch the bare ground. They acknowledged him as a king, their king, a true king. And as he passed by the path that comes down from the Mount of Olives, they became almost delirious with joy, because the Mount of Olives is where the prophet Zechariah tells us we will meet the Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One. In truth, Jesus' ride paled in comparison to another parade, a military parade that just about at that same time was taking place on the other side of town. That's where the war horses were, as the governor, Pontius Pilate, along with his legions of Roman soldiers, came into Jerusalem to oversee the Passover festival. Passover is the great and ancient Jewish celebration of freedom from slavery, freedom from captivity. Passover was a tricky time for the Romans, for their commanders and their administrators and what we think of as the Holy Land. They knew, and the people knew, that Passover was a celebration of release from a brutal regime. They knew, and the people knew, that this particular celebration was dangerous because it stirred up hope in the people's hearts. It stirred up dreams of tasting freedom once again. Pilate's job was to squash entirely any such notions. Two leaders rode into town coming from opposite directions. One leader rode in to rule. One leader rode in to die. One rode in as part of a military parade, and one as the leader of what was really a protest march, a group of people proclaiming joyfully, there is a better way, the way of Jesus. And we are witnesses. And then 6 days passed, and we have shared now the story of that long night of trial, of questioning and suffering that Jesus went through on the night when he was betrayed. The one who came as a servant, the one who came to die, knows what is coming. He's been telling his closest followers about it for weeks, maybe months. He knows that he is the target of the predictable crackdown of Rome on anyone who dares dream of, speak of, or even hope for freedom. He knows that pain and death lie at the end of this night. Pontius Pilate, the leader who came to rule, thinks he has things well in hand. He thinks he's in control, but actually events are spinning out of his grasp. At first, he doesn't understand that his own presence, that brutal crackdown, the arrest of Jesus, what these things have done to the people who cheered Jesus on 6 days ago. It has terrified them. And in their terror, all they can think to do is run themselves from Jesus. To say, no, not him, we didn't mean it. He isn't our king at all. The instinct to survive, the most primal drive in every creature. And so they called for his death. They denied him. They ran from him. They hid. Pilate strikes the tone of the reasonable one, as if everyone would just listen to him, things would work out just fine. Don't be fooled by his cool veneer. He does everything he can to avoid responsibility for what is about to happen. Pilate, too, is terrified. He is terrified of the people. First, he gives his opinion that Jesus isn't guilty of anything. When the people object, he sends Jesus to Herod, hoping he'll take care of this thing. But when Jesus is returned to him, and he can't avoid responsibility, he decides to have Jesus flogged. This is true to form, and it's no cursory slap of the hands. It's torture, and it's designed to weaken the prisoner, to cause extreme bodily injuries and loss of blood, so that when at last the prisoner is crucified, they will die quickly. The moment Pilate decided to have Jesus flogged, whatever his words were, he had already decided that Jesus would die on the cross. We are witnesses. But this strange servant king rode in to die. He came to perform the ultimate service, to endure his passion, the ultimate act of love, to take in the violence, to be the scapegoat that Rome needed at that moment, to die so that others might live. When at last Jesus is nailed to the cross, he is left to die between two criminals who, as it turns out, are actually guilty of the crime Jesus was charged with: sedition, treason. As death approaches, we hear his words from the cross. He speaks to God, saying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And we are witnesses. Jesus, the one who comes bringing forgiveness. He speaks to one of the criminals dying alongside him, saying, truly, I tell you, this day you will be with me in paradise. And we are witnesses. The power of God in and through this dying servant king will bring redemption. And with his dying breath, Jesus turns to God again, crying out, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And we are witnesses. God, our maker, the one who is our source as well as our goal, and Jesus is our companion in all of it, in the living and the suffering and the dying. And then silence. Today we are witnesses. We are witnesses to Jesus' passion, a word that means suffering, but also a word that means love. Powerful love. Life-altering love. Love that pours itself out, whatever the cost. Love that endures beyond the grave. Thanks be to God. Amen.